Corporal Morrison, stand down. That's a direct order. You are not authorized to enter that kill zone. Lieutenant Colonel James Hartwell screamed those words at a 25-year-old Navy SEAL who had just volunteered to swim across the Mekong Delta's deadliest stretch of water to rescue 3 wounded Marines trapped on a sinking patrol boat. The veteran commander saw him as just another young hotshot who would get himself and others killed in what intelligence called a suicide mission through enemy-controlled waters. But in exactly 90 seconds, when Corporal Danny Bulldog Patterson would radio his final desperate message before disappearing beneath the muddy brown water, that reckless young SEAL would be the only man with both the skill and the courage to defy orders, dive into a river crawling with Viet Cong snipers, and emerge 43 minutes later carrying 2 Marines on his back, proving that sometimes the greatest acts of valor happen when a soldier chooses to save lives over following orders. Before we dive into this untold story from the Mekong Delta in 1967, where a young Frank Morrison faced the choice between military discipline and saving American lives, tell us in the comments, have you ever had to choose between following rules and doing what you knew was right? And if you believe that true courage sometimes means standing alone against authority when lives hang in the balance, hit that subscribe button because this story will show you the moment that forged a legend and the price one young SEAL paid for putting brotherhood above orders. The Mekong Delta, South Vietnam, March 15th, 1967. The morning mist hung over the brown water like a shroud, carrying with it the smell of diesel fuel, rotting vegetation, and something else, fear. It was the kind of fear that settled in your bones when you knew Charlie owned both sides of the river, and every bend could be your last. Firebase Delta 7 had been Frank Morrison's home for 8 months now. A collection of sandbags, corrugated metal, and stubborn American determination carved out of hostile jungle. The base sat on a slight rise overlooking the Mekong's treacherous waters, where Navy PBR boats ran daily patrols through what intelligence called the most dangerous river in Vietnam. Corporal Frank Tank Morrison crouched behind the metal hull of PBR-47, watching the smoke rise from PBR-23 across the deadly stretch of water. At 25, he was already known throughout SEAL Team 2 as the man you wanted beside you when things went sideways underwater. His teammates called him Tank, not because of his size, but because nothing could stop him once he decided to move forward. Frank had grown up in Sacramento, the son of a World War II Navy veteran who'd instilled in him 2 unshakable beliefs: never leave a man behind and always finish what you start. Those beliefs had carried him through BUDS training at Coronado, through months of jungle warfare preparation, and into the muddy hell of the Mekong Delta, where young Americans learned that heroism wasn't about glory. It was about making sure your brothers came home alive. The morning's patrol had started routinely. 2 PBR boats, 8 Marines, a routine sweep of the river bend where intelligence suspected Viet Cong supply lines. Frank's boat, PBR-47, had taken the north bank. Danny Patterson's boat, PBR-23, had swept the south. Standard procedure practiced 100 times, but Charlie had been waiting. "Tank, we've got a problem," whispered Petty Officer Mike Radar Williams, pointing across the 400 yards of open water. Through his binoculars, Frank could see the carnage. PBR-23 had hit a mine. The boat was listing hard to starboard, taking on water fast, and 3 Marines were trapped on the sinking vessel. The radio crackled with desperation. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Bulldog 17. We've got wounded, taking heavy fire. Boat is going down. Request immediate extraction." That was Danny Patterson, a 19-year-old Marine from Boston who'd been in country only 6 weeks. Frank had shared a beer with him just 2 nights ago at Firebase Charlie. The kid had shown him pictures of his girlfriend back home, talked about proposing when he got back. Lieutenant Colonel James Hartwell, a 20-year Army veteran commanding the joint operation, studied the tactical situation through his field glasses. The colonel was old-school military, a Korean War veteran who'd seen too many young soldiers die from reckless heroics. His weathered face bore the scars of Incheon and Chosin Reservoir, and his philosophy was simple. Calculated risks were acceptable, suicide missions were not. Negative Bulldog 17, water approach impossible. Sniper positions confirmed on both banks. We'll call in air support. But Frank knew the mathematics of disaster. Air support meant F-4 Phantoms screaming in from Da Nang, 20 minutes minimum flight time. Artillery meant danger-close fire missions that might hit the Marines they were trying to save. PBR-23 was taking on water through a hull breach, listing heavily to starboard. The boat had maybe 4 minutes before it went under completely, taking 3 wounded Marines to the bottom of the Mekong. "Sir, air support is 20 minutes out," Frank said, moving closer to Hartwell. "That boat won't last 5 minutes." Hartwell turned, his weathered face grim. "Corporal, I've been fighting wars since you were in diapers. That stretch of water is a kill zone. Charlie's got overlapping fields of fire from both sides. It's suicide." Frank stripped off his gear, down to his combat knife and sidearm. "Sir, with respect, I can make that swim. Underwater approach, surface behind their position." "Absolutely not." Hartwell's voice cut like steel. "I will not lose a SEAL team leader on a rescue mission that intel rates at 0% survival." The radio erupted again. "We're taking on water fast. Johnson's unconscious. Thompson's got shrapnel in his chest. Please, somebody help us." Frank looked across the water, calculating angles, current speed, enemy positions. His mind was already mapping the underwater route. Swim deep. Use the sunken logs for cover. Surface behind the boat. Get the wounded to safety. "Tank. Don't even think about it," Williams whispered. "The old man's right." That's a death sentence. But Frank was already moving toward the water's edge when Hartwell's voice exploded behind him. "Corporal Morrison, stand down." "That's a direct order. You are not authorized to enter that kill zone." Frank paused at the water's edge, every instinct in his body at war with 25 years of military discipline. Orders were absolute. Disobedience was court-martial territory. But across that deadly stretch of water, 3 Marines were dying. He thought about Danny O'Sullivan's girlfriend, about the letter she'd never receive, about 3 mothers who would get folded flags instead of living sons. "Sir," Frank said quietly, not turning around, "some orders can't be followed." And then he dove. The Mekong swallowed him like a hungry mouth. 30 feet down, the water was black as midnight, filled with debris, rotting vegetation, and the ghosts of 100 other river battles. Frank swam with powerful, silent strokes, his lungs burning, following the bottom contour he'd memorized in those crucial seconds. The Mekong Delta's muddy bottom was treacherous terrain, littered with submerged logs, abandoned equipment, and worse things that Frank tried not to think about. The current was stronger than it looked from the surface, a relentless force that wanted to drag him downstream into Charlie-controlled territory where American prisoners simply disappeared. Frank's SEAL training kicked in. Controlled breathing, efficient movement, constant situational awareness even in zero visibility. He'd learned to navigate underwater using current flow, temperature gradients, and intuition honed through months of training in rivers from California to Florida. But the Mekong was different from any training environment. This river had teeth. Above him, AK-47 fire chattered across the water. The Viet Cong had seen him dive, were spraying the surface hoping for a lucky shot. Muzzle flashes flickered through the muddy water like deadly fireflies, and Frank could hear the angry whine of bullets cutting through the river above his head. But Frank was already 150 yards out, moving like a shadow beneath the chaos. His father's voice echoed in his mind, words spoken over dinner tables in Sacramento, lessons learned from a man who'd survived Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima. "Son, when your brothers are in trouble, you don't count the cost. You pay whatever the price is and figure out how to live with the bill later." His lungs screamed for air, but he pushed deeper, using a submerged tree as cover. 200 yards, 300. The boat's hull came into view through the murky water, tilted, sinking. Precious seconds ticking away. Frank surfaced behind the stern, gasping quietly. PBR-23 was going down fast, the engine compartment already flooded. Through the gunfire, he could hear Danny O'Sullivan shouting coordinates into the radio, his young voice cracking with desperation. "Bulldog, this is Tank," Frank called out as he hauled himself over the stern rail. Danny's eyes went wide with disbelief and hope. "Tank! Jesus, how did you—" "No time. How many wounded?" "Thompson's unconscious, shrapnel in the chest. Anderson took a round in the shoulder, but he's mobile." "I'm okay. Just scared shitless." The boat shuddered as another section flooded. They had maybe 2 minutes before it went under completely. Frank made the calculation that would haunt him for the next 50 years. He could save 2, but not all 3. Not all. "Listen carefully," he told Danny. I'm taking Thompson first. He's the worst. You help Anderson to the stern rail. When I come back, we go together. What if you don't make it back? Danny's voice was barely a whisper. Frank gripped the young Marine's shoulder. I'll make it back. That's a promise. He hoisted the unconscious Thompson over his shoulder, 220 pounds of dead weight, and slipped back into the Mekong. Swimming underwater with a wounded man was like trying to fly with anchor chains, but Frank's training kicked in. Slow, steady strokes, conserve oxygen, trust the current. The first rescue was textbook SEAL operation. Frank moved Thompson's dead weight with practiced efficiency, using buoyancy techniques learned in the cold waters off Coronado. But textbook operations didn't account for the emotional weight of carrying a dying 19-year-old through enemy-controlled waters while AK-47 fire-stitched patterns across the surface overhead. Thompson was unconscious, blood seeping from shrapnel wounds in his chest, his breathing shallow and labored. Frank held the young Marine's head above water with one arm while swimming with the other, following underwater features he'd memorized during the dive-in. Every few seconds, he had to surface briefly for air, exposing both of them to sniper fire from the riverbanks. The trip back took 8 agonizing minutes. When Frank finally surfaced at PBR-47, Williams and the other SEALs hauled Thompson aboard and immediately started first aid. Williams, a Navy corpsman before joining the teams, worked with practiced efficiency, cutting away Thompson's blood-soaked uniform and applying pressure bandages to the worst wounds. How is he? Frank gasped, still treading water. He'll make it if we get him to the aid station, Williams replied. Tank, the boat's going under. Frank was already diving again, his lungs burning, his shoulders screaming from the first rescue. But Danny O'Sullivan was still out there, along with the wounded Johnson, and Frank Morrison had never broken a promise to a fellow serviceman. The second crossing was harder. Frank was running on pure adrenaline and stubbornness, fighting the current and his own exhaustion. His shoulder muscles burned from the first rescue, and his lungs felt like they were on fire. But somewhere across that deadly stretch of water, Danny Patterson and Anderson were clinging to life on a sinking boat, trusting that the crazy SEAL who'd already risked court-martial for them would keep his promise. When he reached PBR-23, only the bow was still above water. Danny and Anderson were clinging to the forward rail, water up to their chests. The boat's diesel fuel was spreading across the surface in rainbow slicks, and Frank could smell cordite from the mine explosion mixing with river water and blood. Tank! Jesus, I thought you weren't coming back. Danny gasped, his young face pale with shock and relief. I keep my promises, Marine, Frank replied, already calculating the swim back with 2 wounded men. Time to go, Marines, Frank gasped. This time he had to take both men. Anderson, though wounded, could still swim. Frank positioned himself between them, Anderson on his left, Danny on his right, and began the most desperate swim of his life. Halfway across, Anderson started going under. The shoulder wound was worse than they'd thought, and he was losing blood fast. Frank made a split-second decision that would earn him a Silver Star and a lifetime of nightmares. He let go of Danny to save Anderson. Keep swimming, he shouted to Danny. Follow my bubbles. The citation would later describe it as conspicuous gallantry, but for Frank, those moments in the muddy water were something more personal and terrifying. The instant when you realize that saving someone might cost you everything, and you choose to pay that price anyway. Frank dove with Anderson, using his body to shield the wounded Marine from debris, fighting the current that wanted to drag them both downstream into Charlie-controlled territory. Anderson was fading fast, his grip loosening, his eyes rolling back. Frank had seen that look before, the moment when a wounded man decides it's easier to let go than keep fighting. Stay with me, Marine! Frank shouted underwater, knowing Anderson couldn't hear him but needing to say it anyway. Your mama's waiting for you back home. When they surfaced, Anderson was barely conscious, but they were only 50 yards from safety. Behind them, Danny Patterson was swimming the fight of his young life, staying afloat through pure determination and the knowledge that Frank Morrison had risked everything to give him this chance. The young Marine from Boston had never been a strong swimmer, but adrenaline and desperation carried him through waters that should have claimed him. Later, he would say that Frank's voice-calling encouragement kept him going when his arms felt like lead and his lungs screamed for air. All 3 Marines made it back alive. Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell was waiting at the water's edge when Frank finally hauled himself onto the muddy bank, carrying Anderson, with Danny stumbling behind them. The colonel's face was unreadable, part fury, part admiration, all military discipline. Behind him, the entire SEAL team and half the firebase had gathered to watch the impossible rescue that would become legend in the Delta. Corporal Morrison, Hartwell said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions that would echo through official reports and personal consciences. "You disobeyed a direct order." Frank, still gasping for breath, river water and blood dripping from his uniform, met the colonel's eyes without flinching. He'd known this moment would come the instant he hit the water. Military justice was swift and unforgiving, especially for enlisted men who defied officers in combat zones. "Yes, sir, I did." "In doing so, you saved 3 American lives." "Yes, sir." Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, studying the young SEAL who had just redefined the meaning of courage under his command. Around them, the firebase had gone silent. Even the artillery had stopped firing, as if the entire war was waiting for this conversation to play out. "Son, what you did today was either the stupidest thing I've ever witnessed or the bravest. I honestly can't decide which." Frank straightened, water still dripping from his uniform, mud caked in his hair, exhaustion weighing on his shoulders like a physical force. Around him, the silence stretched taut as piano wire. Every man at Firebase Delta 7 knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about in mess halls and barracks for decades to come. "Sir, with respect, it doesn't matter which one it was. Those Marines are going home." The colonel's eyes held Frank's for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Hartwell nodded once, a sharp military acknowledgement that carried the weight of professional respect earned through blood and muddy water. "Dismissed, Corporal. Get yourself cleaned up and report to the aid station. That's not a request." As Frank walked away, his legs shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline crash, he heard Hartwell address the assembled troops. "What you witnessed here today, gentlemen, is why we don't leave people behind. Not ever. Some of you will go home and tell stories about the war. This is the story you tell your sons." That night, Danny Patterson found Frank cleaning his weapon by the firebase perimeter. The young Marine sat down beside him, both men staring out at the dark water that had nearly claimed all their lives. The Mekong flowed past them in the darkness, carrying with it the debris of war, pieces of boats, equipment, and sometimes things they tried not to think about. The sounds of Firebase Delta 7 settling into night watch surrounded them. The distant crackle of radio chatter, the soft hum of generators, the occasional cough or muffled conversation from the bunkers. But between Frank and Danny, there was only the kind of silence that comes after men have looked death in the face together and lived to tell about it. "Tank," Danny said quietly, "why'd you risk court-martial for us? You didn't even know us." Frank kept cleaning his rifle, the methodical motions helping him process what had happened. The M16's components felt familiar and solid in his hands. Reliable, predictable, unlike the chaos of combat where good men died and survival often came down to split-second decisions that haunted you forever. "Danny, there's something you learn in the teams. We don't leave people behind. Not ever. Orders are important, but some things are more important than orders." "Like what?" Frank looked at the young Marine, seeing in his face the same determination that had kept him swimming across those deadly waters. In Danny's eyes, Frank saw something else, the recognition that he would carry this moment for the rest of his life, that it would shape every decision he made from this day forward. "Like making sure you get home to propose to that girl." Danny smiled for the first time since the mine explosion. "You remember that?" "I remember everything that matters." Danny was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the earnest intensity that only young men facing mortality could muster. "Tank, I've been thinking about what happened today, about the choice you made. What about it? You could have drowned. All of us could have drowned, but you didn't hesitate, not for a second. How do you do that? How do you decide to risk everything for people you barely know?" Frank set down his rifle and looked out at the Mekong, where moonlight danced on the water like silver coins scattered across black silk. He thought about his father's stories from the Pacific, about the men who died at Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal, about the weight of survival when good men don't make it home. "Danny, My old man used to tell me something when I was growing up. He said, "Son, you don't get to choose when courage is required. You only get to choose whether you answer the call. Today, when I heard your voice on that radio, calling for help, that was the call. Everything else was just swimming." The young Marine nodded slowly as if Frank's words were settling into a place in his mind where they would live forever. "I won't forget this, Tank. What you did today, what you taught me, I'll carry it with me. Just remember to pass it on," Frank replied. "Someday, somewhere, someone's going to need help, and you're going to be the only one who can provide it. When that moment comes, don't count the cost. Pay the price and figure out how to live with the bill later." Is that what you did today? Paid a price. Frank was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell's words, about the official reprimand that would probably go in his file alongside the commendation, about the fine line between heroism and insubordination that every combat soldier learned to walk. "Danny, every choice has a price. The question isn't whether you'll pay it. The question is whether you can live with the cost of not acting. Today, I couldn't live with letting you die. Everything else is just paperwork." 6 months later, Frank Morrison was promoted to Petty Officer First Class and awarded the Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States. The citation read, in part, "Petty Officer Morrison's complete disregard for his own safety, while in clear violation of direct orders, resulted in the successful rescue of 3 wounded United States Marines from certain death." Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell pinned the medal on Frank's dress blues personally. As he stepped back to salute, he whispered, "Son, I've recommended you for disciplinary action and for commendation." The commendation won. Danny Patterson went home to Boston in December 1967. He married his high school sweetheart on Valentine's Day 1968 and named his firstborn son Frank. He never forgot the SEAL who chose brotherhood over orders. 43 years later, when a 68-year-old Frank Morrison would stand at the edge of San Diego floodwaters, watching an 8-year-old girl disappear beneath the surface, the same voice that had defied Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell would whisper in his mind, "Some things are more important than orders. Some things are more important than safety. Some things are worth any risk." That young SEAL from the Mekong Delta had never really left the water. He was still there, still swimming, still carrying wounded Marines to safety. Still proving that true courage isn't about age or authority. It's about the moment you decide that someone else's life is worth more than your own safety. And on that March day in 1967, in the muddy waters of the Mekong Delta, Frank "Tank" Morrison learned a lesson that would guide every rescue for the rest of his life. When lives hang in the balance, the only order that matters is the one written in your heart. The ripples from that single act of defiance would spread across 5 decades, touching lives Frank would never meet in situations he couldn't imagine, because real heroism isn't a moment. It's a choice you make over and over again, every time someone needs saving. From the jungles of Vietnam to the floodwaters of San Diego, Frank Morrison never stopped choosing to dive in.